Ueshiba Morihei, the founder of Aikido, is one of the most mysterious figures in all of martial arts history. His followers believe he could dodge bullets, he could take down opponents without even touching them. Some even believe he could see a few seconds into the future. Sounds impossible, right? So why do these incredible, borderline insane stories still survive, and why do people still believe them today? In this video, we are going to answer just that question. We are unraveling the legend and the myths of Ueshiba, tracing the real events that helped shape Aikido and its philosophy. We are going to separate what's fact from fantasy and what Ueshiba's near religious devotion actually means for the practitioners of his martial art. Finally, at the end of the video, I'll share my take on why I think so many people still choose to believe these myths and legends about Ueshiba today. So if you like digging deep into these amazing unanswered questions about martial arts, then hit like and subscribe to the channel now to make sure you never miss a video, and let's get stuck in. Ueshiba Morihei was born on December 14th, 1883 in Tanabe, Japan. The only son to his family, he was a frail and weak child, so his father encouraged him to practice martial arts. Ueshiba studied Kenjutsu, Bojutsu, Daitō-ryū Aiki-jūjutsu, Judo and even Sumo. Then, as a young man, he served in the Japanese army in the Russo-Japanese War, in which he saw first-hand trauma, violence and death before he was eventually discharged in 1907. But it was after all that his story turned to legend in one of the most dramatic ways possible, in which he escaped from execution by a Chinese firing squad. So let's back up a little. In the 1920s, Ueshiba joined a spiritual sect called the Omoto. This was led by a charismatic leader called Deguchi Onasabudo. So in the late 1920s, the Omoto set out for Manchuria, where they hoped to locate Shambhala, a Buddhist promised land, which Deguchi foretold would become a land of peace. But instead of paradise, the Omoto found Manchuria to be a wasteland torn apart by ongoing conflicts from China, Japan, Russia. Soon after their arrival, the Omoto were arrested by Chinese soldiers accused of being spies. Their hands and feet were shackled, and the group were led out across a body-strewn firing range, tied to posts, awaiting death. Ueshiba and a few others stood tall. They refused the blindfold, willing to face death head-on. Just as the rifles were raised, ready to take the shot, a soldier ran across the field, brandishing a piece of paper, new orders. At the last moment, the execution was called off. The Omoto were released. They were given back their horses, and they quickly rode west, trying to get out of there as fast as possible. Was it divine intervention or just pure luck? Nobody knew, but their freedom didn't last long. Within days, the group were being tracked by Chinese troops again, and soon after they were pinned down in a valley, with gunfire coming in over the top. Then, in that desperate moment, something changed. Ueshiba felt a sudden burst of clarity and purpose, and as the bullets arced down, he saw each one tracing a golden pathway through the air. He could see where the bullets were heading. Guided by these beams of golden light, he led the Omoto through the crossfire and out of the valley, miraculously escaping without a single injury. Twice now, Ueshiba had faced his death on this journey, and twice he'd escaped unscathed, and he was forever transformed by this new understanding of life, death, and the power that lies between them. Back in Japan, Ueshiba was a changed man. He now believed his life purpose was clear. Drawing on his childhood studies of Daitō-ryū Aiki-jūjutsu and other systems of martial arts, Ueshiba began crafting something new, a martial art shaped by the spiritual ideals of the Omoto, a style that was not for domination, but was for self-improvement and could be used for peace rather than violence. He called it Aikido, or the way of harmonious spirit. Ueshiba soon reached celebrity status for his skills, and as his reputation grew, people came from all over Japan to visit him, to learn under him, and some even to challenge him. One duel in particular left a long-lasting mark on Ueshiba and Aikido. One afternoon, a high-ranking naval officer and master of kendo arrived at the dojo. He was proud and skilled and unwilling to leave without a duel, so reluctantly, Ueshiba agreed to face him. Ueshiba took a wooden sword from the rack, as did his opponent, and the two men stepped onto the mats. The officer bowed briefly and then lunged forwards with lightning-fast attacks. Much like the bullets, Ueshiba saw these golden arcs of the strikes and moved just out of range. The officer swung again and again until exhaustion overtook him and his arms faltered. Finally, he dropped his weapon, defeated and bewildered. Ueshiba knelt beside the man and told him there was no shame in defeat. He told him how strength and victory were just illusions, and that true mastery came from harmony with the universe itself. Ueshiba then walked out into the garden to fetch some water from a stone well. As he lifted up the bucket, he felt the earth tremble beneath his feet. From nowhere, a golden mist rose up around him, filling his vision with light. And in that moment, he felt a sudden harmony with all things. He lost all material attachment to possessions or self and truly transcended to the level of a prophet. So this is the legendary tale that we often hear of Ueshiba. Cinematic, inspiring, but it also raises a lot of questions. And that's exactly what we're going to discuss in the next section. So now let's talk about some of the common criticisms of Ueshiba's story. First of all, it must be noted that a lot of what we hear from this story comes firsthand from Ueshiba himself, or through biographies and different accounts of his life. Therefore, it is impossible for us to know what his exact experiences are. This was a time when there was very little cameras, so word of mouth counted for a lot. And as the stories of his incredible skills were passed on, it's no surprise that they became fairly crazy at points. It's known that Ueshiba actually denied many of the myths surrounding him. However, there is some hard evidence that we can discuss. So first of all, when talking about the Omoto connection, it should be noted that Japan has a long history of spiritual and cult-like movements, especially those rooted in Shinto, which ties different spirits to places and people and objects. This background helps us to explain how Ueshiba became so engrossed in the Omoto sect and followed Deguchi so strongly, and also how the Omoto philosophy became so important in Aikido. However, historically, Deguchi's reputation was extremely polarizing. He was a known polymath, fluent in several languages, a skilled poet, writer, artist, and mystic. However, there were many that saw him as a con man. At one point, he was openly labelled the biggest charlatan in history, and a childhood friend even stated it was impossible to tell if Deguchi was a genius or a fool. However, given that he led an overland expedition through a war-torn Chinese republic searching for a fabled Buddhist promised land, I would be inclined to think the latter. Second, when addressing the firing squad and the escape, this is actually fairly well documented by both Omoto accounts and also military records. There are even photos of the group in chains awaiting execution. Several historians have suggested this was likely a staged intimidation tactic rather than a true execution attempt. While some people suggest that they were released because the Chinese army didn't have working rifles, I find that rather hard to believe. Some scholars think there was never any intention of the Chinese executing the prisoners, and suggest that Deguchi, who was a well-known public figure, was deliberately captured and then released to curry favour with the Japanese, who were already moving into Manchuria at that point. In terms of the later escape, personally I find it unlikely that a squad of soldiers were unable to hit a group of unarmed pacifists, especially from the high ground when their opponents were down in a valley. However, without exact military records, that's hard to verify. The shots that they heard could have been warning shots that were attempting to intimidate the Omoto. Another possibility might be psychological. Under extreme stress, memory can distort, and trauma reshapes the way that people perceive things, particularly in group recollections like that of the Omoto followers. Because they all agree on one story, it's possible they might have made like a group construction of this amazing escape that actually wasn't anything near as dramatic as it sounds. Particularly, it should be noted that Ueshiba's experience mirrors that of soldiers who have been in combat zones, where they remember themselves as being untouchable, or bullets can't hit them as they walk through a wall of fire. This is actually a well-recognised symptom of wartime PTSD. Now, I'm not a medical doctor or a psychologist, so I'm not saying that this is any hard and fast conclusion, but it does offer some insight as to why Ueshiba and his companions felt the way they did did about the situation. So in terms of Ueshiba's duel with the naval officer, one of Ueshiba's biographers states how the story that Ueshiba told changed many times over the years, and eventually there were like a number of duels and fights that kind of got merged into one conclusive story. Now, while eyewitnesses do recall incredible movement, speed, agility, and the power of Ueshiba against much larger and stronger opponents, whether or not there was any actual supernatural elements or moments of enlightenment that came across the guy, it's impossible to say. However, the feeling of like divine light and a oneness with nature is a fairly common religious experience for people throughout the world and from all different backgrounds. So it may well be true that Ueshiba felt this connection. However, whether or not that led into any actual supernatural powers, I still feel fairly skeptical about that. So what do you think? Do myths like Ueshiba's strengthen martial arts history, or do they simply make them harder to take seriously? Let me know in the comments section below. So then finally, why do people still believe these myths and legends today? I believe they actually serve three key purposes. The first of which is elevation of status. They elevate Ueshiba himself, turning him from a human figurehead of a martial art into this godlike character. They claim he transcended violence and materialism and actually became like a living saint or a prophet of peace. To his followers, that's powerful stuff. Who wouldn't want to learn a martial art from a guy who was literally invincible or could see into the future? In that sense, these myths become marketing, and they had a very strong effect of drawing people in, attracting them to Aikido and believing that they are connected to something far greater. Even today, this continues as we see people doing these like no-touch knockouts and using blasts of chi magic against their opponents. Unfortunately, it is still an effective marketing tool. The second function the story serves is providing martial legitimacy. Although this legend doesn't really give any provable evidence of Ueshiba's martial skill, it certainly paints a picture of someone who is very skilled, supernatural or not. And after all, if someone has faced death several times, they've literally been in wars and been chained up facing a firing squad, doesn't it stand to reason that they would actually know what is an effective martial art and the kind of techniques they would need to defend themselves in real life? In this sense, I believe that this legend actually does give us some martial legitimacy here, especially if we understand it as the lens that helps shape the principles and the skills that were chosen to be part of Aikido. Third function it does is create meaning and belonging. Stories have a great ability to help bind people together. Maybe these stories about Ueshiba aren't meant to be taken literally, but rather they are like a parable which can teach us the philosophy and the principles of a martial art, such as choosing to use non-violent techniques against a violent attack. So whether you see his story as symbolic or literal, it certainly has strong philosophical aspects that bleed into the rest of Aikido. But obviously there is a flip side to this too. Taken too literally, these myths and legends about Ueshiba and Aikido can seriously harm the art. They give people unrealistic expectations. They encourage people to believe they can do such feats as perform no-touch KOs or avoid a conflict without having a single scratch on you. And for those reasons, such beliefs can be dangerous. So regardless of whether you choose to buy into the stories and the legends surrounding Ueshiba, he was certainly a very interesting guy, and he certainly lived a very interesting life. And while dodging bullets and becoming invisible and these aspects may be hard to believe, at their core was a man who sought to turn violence into peace. So I guess the question is, does the end justify the means? Was Ueshiba a fraud, or was he a hero, or somewhere in between? Share your thoughts below. I read every comment, so I'm looking forward to hearing from you. If you're interested in learning more about Ueshiba or Aikido in general, I've got some videos on the subjects that I will link, and I will also share affiliate links for several books. First of all, you can check out my book, The Legendary Masters of Martial Arts, in which I talk about Ueshiba in more detail, along with a number of other martial arts icons. I will also link to a biography of Ueshiba called An Invincible Warrior. This is really interesting to read, even if you don't buy into the whole concept. And finally, I will also link The Art of Peace, written by Ueshiba himself. Whether you're a martial artist or not, this is a great little book on philosophy. Finally, if you enjoyed this video, give it a like and subscribe to the channel, and click through my affiliate links to help support the channel further. Until next time, train hard, stay safe, thanks for watching.